The end of 2022 marks 5 years since we watched Luke Skywalker die. Spoilers for the most successful film of 2017 and most argued about movie ever, I guess. But in recognition of this milestone, and a narcissistic desire to ramble about my Star Wars opinions without anyone being able to stop me, I decided that I wanted to talk about my own personal relationship to Luke as a character and how my view and appreciation of him has changed over the years. Luke Skywalker means a lot to me, but he didn't used to, and I think it's interesting why. He's the archetypal hero, which is to say that back during the days of the original trilogy, or even the prequels, people always said, "Oh yeah, Luke's the main character, but Han's the coolest. Everyone actually likes Han. Luke's important, but he's kind of bland and boring." I definitely fell into this camp, although instead of Han, my favorites were Darth Maul and General Grievous, because I was a Shadow the Hedgehog-liking edge boy when I was a kid.
Can you see all of me? Walk into my mystery, step inside the world for dear life.
But in recent years, as I've grown and new Star Wars has come out and people have responded
calmly and rationally,
I've grown as a person and thinker and writer and pretentious jerk. I've really come to see Luke in a new light, to the point that he now might be my third favorite Star Wars character, when before he would definitely not have cracked the top 10 and maybe not even the top 20. So join me, please. Take my hand as I walk you through the evolution of Luke Skywalker and my understanding and appreciation of him. We've got a lot to cover, so as Chris Pratt always says,
Here we go!
Like I said, there seems to be, or at least there seems to have been, a consensus that Luke Skywalker was the bland hero, the boring smiley do-gooder like Superman or Captain America or Jesus. And the characters everyone really likes are the edgier, darker ones like Batman or Iron Man or lovable fan favorite Judas Iscariot. I think a lot of this seems to stem more from the image that Luke took on within our popular culture than it does from his actual character in the films, though once the expanded universe took off, there was room for this image to become his actual character. Of course, when written well, all the other boring smiley do-gooders are likewise more complex than their pop cultural mirages would indicate. But when I've reflected on my thoughts about Luke, I've realized that for a long time I just imposed that mirage of him on top of his character whenever I would go back and watch the original trilogy. I doubt I'm alone in this. Up until a very particular point in time, the image of Luke as he was by the end of his character arc totally overshadowed his entire journey towards that point. And when you watch the original trilogy, only seeing Luke as the good boy hero who solves everything and redeems his dad and saves the galaxy, what are the emotional stakes you're experiencing? Inevitability, maybe? This is what happens, at least for past me, when something is so ubiquitous and omnipresent in popular culture that it's almost impossible to revisit it with fresh eyes, or even have fresh eyes the first time. So what I want to do now is go through Luke's characterization in the original trilogy with a particular focus on elements of his character that I used to overlook, and that I believe the general fandom also tends to overlook. I will be emphasizing these traits more than the movies did for the sake of highlighting them, so don't mistake me pointing out his subtler qualities as me rewriting his character. But revisiting the originals with these traits in mind make the films much deeper for me. And perhaps you might feel the same way. After I talk about that, I'll be looking at how his overall characterization has shifted in the decades since, and especially how the Disney era has dealt with him. Maybe you'll think I'm reaching, maybe you'll think I'm just stating the obvious, or maybe you'll recognize my throbbing genius. Who's to say? One way or another, this is why Luke Skywalker is one of my favorite characters, and why I like him now more than I did as a dumb baby child. So, without further ado, in A New Hope, Luke is a whiny, moody brat. Everyone knows this. The Skywalker whining gene was a popular meme, with people comparing Anakin acting pathetic to Luke going all...
But I was going into Toshi Station to pick up some power converters.
But everyone also knows that he grows out of this, so it's almost seen as, like, a mistake that you have to power through to get to the good stuff. Like it's the first season of the Clone Wars, or the first 2/3 of Rogue One. Sure, fans appreciate that his journey to confident Jedi Master means more because of where he started out, but for a while I didn't really engage with what his personality in his debut film actually means for his character. Luke is written to be relatable to a younger audience, but in a way that is also easily relatable to present-day teens and disaffected young adults who hate how mundane work kills your soul. He wants excitement, to live out a fantasy of adventure, and he also wants to chill out with his friends and doesn't want to be left behind when they move on. He lives on a literal desert planet. You could not get more dead-end than this. So, as a result, Luke starts his journey bored, bitter, and irritable.
But it's a whole nother year.
It's only one more season.
Yeah, that's what she said when Biggs and Tank left.
Where are you going?
Looks like I'm going nowhere.
We can almost buy our own ship for that. But who's gonna fly it, kid?
I'm not such a bad pilot myself. We don't have to sit here and listen.
Let's look at the iconic scene of Luke seeing Leia's hologram message for the first time. We start with him waving a toy ship around like a 5-year-old, then complaining to C-3PO about how bored he is.
Oh, Biggs is right. I'm never gonna get out of here.
Not unless you can alter time, speed up the harvest, or teleport me off this rock.
He then triggers the message, and he immediately reacts with interest, and the nature of his interest is not necessarily altruistic.
Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi.
What's this?
Who is she? She's beautiful.
Our captain was attached
Is there any more to this recording?
What is he feeling about this? He doesn't know Leia, though with hindsight I suppose one could argue he feels a subconscious recognition of his sister.
She's beautiful.
In this moment, does Luke's empathy trigger and get him interested in helping out? Or, given the prior context of the scene,
You know the rebellion against the Empire?
is Luke just excited that something interesting is finally happening and he's leaping at the chance to insert himself into an adventure? Well, it's probably both at the same time. Luke is genuinely the hero. I'm not trying to totally reinvent him as some secretly selfish anti-hero, but how often do people totally ignore even the possibility of more self-interested motives? Considering this as part of Luke gives more nuance to his heroism, and this carries over to when Luke finds out that Leia is on board the Death Star. Remember that the beginning of this scene has Obi-Wan going off on his own Metal Gear Solid mission to shut down the tractor beam after telling a disappointed Luke to stay holed up in the hangar control room.
I want to go with you.
Stay and watch over the droids.
Yet again, Luke is inspired to help Leia, or more accurately just the idea of Leia at this point, as a way of acting out his need for excitement after being frustrated that he isn't able to do what he wants to. This questioning, not refutation, but questioning of Luke's altruism makes him more interesting to me, and I also find it consistent with how he is portrayed in the rest of the trilogy and beyond. While we're here, I also want to point out this moment.
She's rich.
Rich?
Listen, if you were to rescue her, the reward would be,
What?
well, more wealth than you can imagine.
I can imagine quite a bit.
You'll get it.
Luke is being very manipulative, almost dishonest. Sure, he can assume that she's rich, and she could offer Han a reward, but Luke doesn't know that. And it doesn't matter to him if it is true as long as Han believes it enough to help out. Also, Luke is the one who comes up with the entire rescue plan on the spot, including the Chewie and Cuffs idea.
What's your plan?
3PO, hand me those binders there, will ya?
Don't worry, Chewie. I think I know what he has in mind.
It's not a flawless plan, but it works as long as it needs to. I bring these moments up to show a very sneaky and clever side to Luke that I hadn't noticed for a while but really appreciate now. He has a bit of a trickster streak to him, but when you think of that type of character in Star Wars, I imagine Luke is far from the first example to come to most people's minds. This guile nature isn't just something he shows in A New Hope either, as we will see in many more instances later down the line, and yet the cultural osmosis image of Luke is of someone much more straightforward. He is endearingly earnest about a lot of things,
I'm Luke Skywalker. I'm here to rescue you.
and sometimes less endearingly earnest,
What a piece of junk!
but he is no stranger to being a wily, rascally little guy. Another major point I want to hit on is Luke's anger issues. In A New Hope, he is quick to frustration, as we've seen, and even falls into a blind homicidal rage once Obi-Wan is killed. Look at this guy, he's just standing there. No thoughts, just gun, trying to kill as many people as possible until Obi-Wan's ghost has to snap him out of it.
Run, Luke, run!
That's pretty nuts, isn't it? And given how his character develops throughout the rest of the trilogy, it's super important that this trait is established here, that Luke has the potential to go homicidal. Because while Obi-Wan never has the chance to teach Luke very much about the Force, it turns out that this potential within him is the central emotional conflict of the entire trilogy. This is a firm starting point for Luke's growth into a true hero, and after picking out these nuances, intentional or not, I've found his shaky start a lot more entertaining and compelling. This is still my least favorite version of Luke to watch, at least in stories where Luke is a real character and not just a cameo or plot device, but that's a good thing. It means he only improves from here. Empire Strikes Back is sort of like the second start of the franchise. So much of what we think to be iconic about Star Wars doesn't show up at all in A New Hope. The Imperial March theme, for starters, or how about the idea that the Force can be used to lift and move things? Yeah, that doesn't happen at all in A New Hope, but it's the first thing we see the Force do in this movie. Empire refines and expands Star Wars like any good sequel should do, and it certainly does this for Luke. So in the first act of Empire, Luke shows his off-screen development into a strong warrior and cunning rebel military leader. While he does get ganked by a Wampa, he then gets to show off a whole new Force ability before chopping the Yeti's arm off. After his recovery from the whole ordeal, he leads the speeders in the Battle of Hoth, coming up with the tow cable idea himself.
That armor's too strong for Blaster. Use your harpoons and tow cables. Go for the legs. It might be our only chance of stopping them.
And then proceeding to destroy one of the AT-ATs on foot. So within the first 30 minutes of this movie, we see Luke perform the most impressive feat Star Wars has depicted so far. Spoilers, he tops that more than a few times later on. He has definitely progressed a lot in terms of being able to actually back up his confidence. But on the other hand, part of the point of the movie is that Luke's development in this direction is actually misguided. He's gotten better at fighting, which makes perfect sense because he's been with the Rebels for a few years and not training to be a Jedi. Except for the bit where he learns how to use Force telekinesis by himself, with little indication of how he learned this. Maybe Obi-Wan's ghost has been teaching him? Except he acts surprised to see the ghost at the start of this movie, so that can't be it. Expanded universe to the rescue, this is the sort of stuff that's there to fill out, not justifying why Han Solo was actually not wrong about parsecs. Anyway, my point is that in this movie, Luke has been working to be good at fighting and thinks that this is what being a Jedi is all about. That's why he thinks that Master Yoda is some great warrior, only to be countered with,
"Force not make one great."
This whole movie is about challenging Luke's preconceptions, especially concerning what is possible with the Force, and especially the myth about Anakin Skywalker and the trustworthiness of Obi-Wan. In the last film, we had a frustrated, headstrong kid who could lash out in anger and was starved for excitement, who nevertheless had a good heart and sense of duty. In Empire, he certainly isn't starved for excitement anymore, but everything else is still there, and his flaws are dialed up even more. He is impatient and snippy with Yoda to the point where the Muppet rejects teaching him at first, convinced that he will fall to the dark side.
The boy has no patience.
And here we get to what I consider to be the main benefit of laser focusing on all of Luke's warts, all his negative qualities the way I have been doing. The central tension that develops during the trilogy is whether or not Luke will fall to the dark side. That's the point of his vision in the cave. It motivates everything Yoda says to him during training. And if you watch the trilogy only thinking of Luke as the paragon of virtue that he kind of seems to be at the end of the third movie, do you really feel this tension? I didn't. It's that sense of inevitability again, draining the inherent drama out of the situation. This is only a conflict with meaning because Luke has a very real risk of actually going dark. He is angry, spiteful, arrogant, and emotion-driven, and the films depend on him being those things. But when you think of Luke Skywalker, do any of these traits come to mind? When it comes to his training, Luke's biggest problem is his close-mindedness and stubbornness. The key moment is the X-Wing lifting scene when Yoda says,
"You must unlearn what you have learned."
Luke's biggest problem is not that he is too old, it's that Uncle Owen basically sabotaged Luke's ability to easily learn the Force. We can see this hinted at vaguely back in Hope.
It's such a long way from here.
That's your uncle talking.
Luke is slow to tap into the Force because he was raised to have a small-minded view of things. I mean, he isn't pro-Empire, but the only option he could think of aside from farming is the Academy, which is vaguely possibly Imperial in the movie, but is explicitly the Imperial Academy in expanded universe material. His thinking is limited, and that directly hurts his ability to intuitively use the Force to its full potential. Now, hold on a moment. Isn't Luke very creative? How does his guile nature fit alongside him being small-minded about the Force? Well, this is a fascinating contradiction. He is creative when it comes to immediate material reality, but runs into difficulties when he encounters the abstract, which is the entire realm of the Force. The Force runs on dreams and wishes.
I don't believe it.
That is why you fail.
In order to properly use the Force, one has to be in touch with their own dreams and wishes. Unfortunately for Luke, his years having his dreams stamped down on by Uncle Owen have hindered his ability to do that. Over time, as Luke learns more about the Force, he will be able to incorporate this into his creativity. But for now, while training with Yoda, Luke's overly material closed-mindedness prevents him from grasping the Force. It takes Yoda demonstrating the Force's potential right in front of him, bringing the abstract into the material, for him to finally expand his conception of what is possible. And to clarify, I know that Luke is explicitly described as having his head in the clouds and not focusing on the present, which might sound like the opposite of what I've just said. But his daydreams are still based on his preconceptions and on the limited material reality he has already experienced. This whole training arc demonstrates how stubborn Luke can be, and how even if he can be quite creative, it can take effort for him to change his mind once he latches on to an idea. Yoda's training brings out another crucial character flaw. Back in A New Hope, Luke's biggest freakout came when he saw his friend and mentor get murdered in front of him. In Empire, Luke is motivated to abandon his training and confront Darth Vader before he's ready because he sees a vision of his friends in jeopardy. We can see a certain pattern for Luke which Return of the Jedi will cement. He can have his sense of logic overridden by threats to those he cares about, be they physical, verbal, or a vague, threatening vision. This sense of loyalty is not an exclusively negative character trait. It motivates him to stay with the rebels and destroy the Death Star, it forges important bonds with his friends, and leads to him redeeming his father. The importance of loyalty to your friends is a constant through line in the entire franchise, and I love how Luke shows both the good and the bad of this sort of thing. I would argue that his tendency to let himself become irrational in the face of threats to his friends is Luke's biggest flaw, and it's also not one he ever directly confronts or overcomes by the end of the trilogy. If anything, it's validated. But I'm getting ahead of myself, that's the next film. Let's wrap up Empire by reiterating Luke's underrated guile. As I said, Luke shows a good sense of tactics while leading the speeders on Hoth, and the famous tow cable idea is presented as his on-the-fly improvisation. Later, his quick thinking and resourcefulness is demonstrated a few times during his duel with Vader.
Impressive.
I think it's fun to see Luke's creativity as he tries to compensate for being way in over his head. It's actually less emphasized in this film than it is elsewhere, but it is still evident. Empire's a good movie. It's the best Star Wars movie, that's not controversial. Let's get to the real stuff. If the threat of Luke falling to the dark side is important to the tension of Empire, it is absolutely critical to Return of the Jedi. A lot of people see the intro with Jabba as being superfluous to the rest of the movie and sort of a side quest, but it does serve a particular function in Luke's arc. We first see Luke as a holo message, where he's so oddly serene compared to how he's been the last two films. There isn't much to go off of from this message as far as characterization is concerned, beyond, whoa, Luke seems different, what's he up to? When he first shows up in person, though, well. With ominous, non-heroic music, he is framed in silhouette, with his cape billowing out behind him and his hood up, in an appearance very reminiscent of his father. And the first thing he does when he's confronted is force choke some Gamorreans. And just to remind everyone, this whole scheme is Luke's plan.
I'm taking care of everything. Oh.
Luke is presenting himself as calm and in control through this entire sequence while weaving a web of multi-layered deception in which he lies to 3PO and uses all of his friends as bait. And he uses his evil dad's favorite trick the instant he comes onto the scene. This feels really dark, doesn't it? I could easily imagine a young Palpatine movie or series where he's characterized exactly like this. Once again, I'm not bringing this up to criticize Luke or the movie. I love that this is a possible way to read this first act. The emotional conflict for Luke in the climax is whether or not he will fall to the dark side, and with that in mind, the sequence at Jabba's palace is not just a functional way to get Han back while resolving the Jabba subplot from Empire, it's not just a way to open the film with a seemingly more lighthearted sequence than the last, and it's not just fan service to go back to Tatooine, though of course it is all of those things. It is also hinting that Luke is very much at risk of falling to the dark side, which makes this whole film more tense and engrossing. Yes, the beginning is framed as fun and heroic, and knowing how the film ends and how the character has been generally perceived for the subsequent 30 years, it is tempting to only view it through that lens. But I think ignoring its presentation of Luke's darkness really does the film a disservice. It removes tension from the climax and makes the first third feel less justified. I also see a bit of irony, or maybe sloppy filmmaking that enhances the movie anyway, regarding Luke showing off how cool he is now by fighting off a whole bunch of Jabba's henchmen right before going back to talk with the Master who told him wars not make one great. Luke basically goes on a killing spree, boasting the highest on-foot, on-screen body count of anyone in the mainline films other than, maybe, Anakin's massacre of the Separatist leaders in Revenge of the Sith. Luke starts the movie fighting and killing, and his big triumphant moment at the end, the thing he does to prove that he is a true Jedi now, is refuse to fight. Can you say that Luke is framed as too heroic during this scene to really drive the point home? Sure, I'm willing to concede that. There is a reason why this side of Luke is so often ignored after all, and it's not just because hardcore nerds are artistically illiterate. This could have been conveyed better, but it is part of the film, and I think acknowledging it makes the movie better. Now let's talk about the Luke and Vader scenes in this movie. In other words, some of my favorite scenes in the whole franchise. I think Luke's intentions get misunderstood here regarding what his plan really is. When he meets with Vader on Endor before they go up to the Death Star, Luke's hope is that Vader will leave with him and they would never go to see the Emperor at all, which obviously Vader shuts down.
I know there is good in you. That's why you won't bring me to your Emperor now. Come with me.
The Emperor will show you the true nature of the Force. He is your master now.
Then my father is truly dead.
Luke is clearly disappointed by this, and once he is brought in front of the Emperor, he says,
"Soon I'll be dead, and you with me."
It really seems like he isn't planning on getting out of this alive, that he's given up the hope of redeeming Vader and is content to just let himself distract the two Sith while his friends blow them all up. I'm sure he was trying to think of something, but his actual plan was thwarted, and the entire rest of the sequence is him improvising and hoping. Luke and the Emperor chat for a bit and trade insults.
Faith in your mama.
What was that?
I said...
Until Papa Palpatine shows Luke the trap he's set with the Imperial fleet and taunts him until... So, Palpatine totally wins in this moment, right? Luke takes the lightsaber and makes a swing for the Emperor's face, which Vader intercepts. Luke actually falls to temptation and impulsively tries to murder this old man. And it's clear that this is a moment of blind rage, because when we cut back to the duel, Luke is still going full ham on Vader and only calms down to start doing his "I will not fight you, father" thing after he kicks his disabled dad down the stairs and has a moment to catch his breath. Like he has been doing for the rest of the film, he is still visibly struggling with his negative impulses, while at the same time trying to regain a cool head and trying to persuasion check Vader into turning good again. This isn't an immovable paragon trying to turn his father back to the light until one brief moment of a slip-up. This is a seesaw, with both combatants being genuinely tempted to switch sides to the other. And it's so much cooler that way. And now, of course, let's get to the big moment. Vader learns that Luke has a twin sister, and he says that he will go after her and turn her to the dark side. And, as has happened several times already, when Luke is faced with a direct threat to those he cares about, he loses it. He almost falls, and for the second time in the same encounter, no less. It feels so much more natural when you've been paying attention to Luke's own darker side, but watching him almost lose by winning, only to realize the path he is headed towards and pulling back, is always satisfying. So he tosses his lightsaber away to show he will not fight anymore, proving that it's a real shame Yoda never told him he could use it to block lightning. So it's definitely a stretch to say that Luke spent this entire encounter idealistically and constantly trying to get his father to come back to the light. But what actually happens is a more meaningful and dramatic scene. And this is not to say that he doesn't actually believe in his father. He has spent the film holding on to the hope that his father has good left in him. Luke just doesn't have as firm a grip on that hope in the heat of battle and in the face of his own darkness. And when Luke says,
I am a Jedi, like my father before me,
he has, for the time being, cemented his hope. I think that he doesn't just pull back from patricide when he sees Vader's robot hand and looks at his own. I think he forms a true empathetic connection. Luke sees how far his father has fallen and directly relates it to himself when he sees their Robo-Hand twins. But then he turns away from the dark and says that he and Anakin are the same by being Jedi. He doesn't just realize their similarities in potential darkness, he demonstrates to Vader that someone who is like him could turn back to the light, so Vader does. But this isn't an analysis of Vader, it's of Luke. And before we close out Return of the Jedi, I'd like to return to Luke's trickster side, which plays out quite a bit on Endor in ways I didn't notice at first, but I absolutely love. When Han, Luke, Chewbacca, and the droids first encounter the Ewoks, watch Luke's reactions, they're gold. He thinks what's happening is so funny, especially the way Han is getting riled up.
proper.
Look at him, he loves it. Of course, he quickly shifts to serious mode once it looks like Han will escalate into actual violence. Then there's the sort of amused and amusing way he gets the Ewoks to let them go and not eat them.
Tell them if they don't do as you wish, you'll become angry and use your magic.
I couldn't possibly.
Just tell them.
Again, it's a show of his cleverly deceitful side, and at this point he's clearly capable of having fun with such ruses.
Thanks, Theo.
I never knew I had it in me.
I adore these moments, and given how serious a lot of people think of Jedi Luke as being, I just wanted to point them out. So that rounds off Luke in the original trilogy. I hope, after all that, you can see the less appreciated sides to his character that I've found so fascinating. But for better and for worse, this is not the end of stories with Luke Skywalker in them. So let's take a quick breath, like the one Luke got after his 2 attempts at murder. Just breathe in and out. Think about calm ocean waves and not about toxic fandoms. Okay, ready? Probably not, but let's do this anyway. I don't want to spend too much time on the old expanded universe because there's so much of it, and I've personally only experienced a fraction of it, so consider this a bit of a loose summary of how Luke Skywalker has been portrayed in the years between original and sequel films. In Timothy Zahn's Thrawn trilogy, we see what I think is the perfect depiction of a Luke Skywalker a few years after Return of the Jedi. He continues along the trajectory of mellowing out his negative traits while never really forgetting that any of them exist. In fact, he even admits that the Emperor got him to attempt murder. But he's calmer, and he's started to try to apply his I can fix him mentality to more than just Vader. He succeeds in redeeming his future wife Mara Jade, and he attempts, but fails, to redeem Joruus C'baoth. I don't know if I pronounced that name right. I like Luke's arc in this trilogy, where he basically has to learn how best to carry on the Jedi without proper guidance from Obi-Wan and Yoda, in a sort of meta-commentary on how the expanded universe had to tell more stories without much help from George Lucas. This was a super popular trilogy for good reason. It's genuinely a great continuation. And I can't really say that continuing to soften Luke up is a bad thing, because it does make sense that he would be like this as he gets older and wiser. It does feel like a little bit of an exaggeration to have him on just a big redemption kick, but it's not nonsensical. And he does question if he's being arrogant and presumptive while he's trying to figure out how to help Mara Jade and C'baoth, which I think is a nice touch. Can I just say how annoyed I get when people lump in the clone Luke named Luke with 2 U's in with all the other bad EU stuff that Disney was good to get rid of? I mean, yeah, when I describe it like that, it really does sound stupid, but the way people talk about the clone, it's like he was a major character or something, running around being all like, "Wahaha, I am your evil twin, Luke, now we are rivals forever." But no, he only shows up in the last half of the last book of the trilogy and serves two specific purposes. He is a thematic foil to Luke, as a version of him who does not think for himself and just follows the orders of his elders, and he is a way for Mara Jade to get out of Palpatine's mental order for her to kill Luke Skywalker on a technicality. He doesn't have any lines, he doesn't even have a mind of his own. He's just a symbolic meat puppet with a lightsaber who serves his purpose for the story and immediately dies. But people lump him in with dumb stuff like Dark Empire, which we will get to in just a second, and all the extra Death Star knockoffs and say, oh yeah, Luke, good thing he's not canon anymore. Read a book. Or 3. These books. And also way more, literacy is cool. So let's move on to Dark Empire. I don't like it. It's not very good and indulges in most of the worst tendencies of the old Star Wars EU. But the artwork by Cam Kennedy is very cool, and there is an interesting idea there that Luke is aching to really get to know his dead father on a personal level. I don't quite buy the idea that in order to do this he would turn to the dark side to feel what tempted his father. I mean, he already did feel that temptation, so the only new experience he gets out of this is getting mind-dominated by Papa Palpatine. You're into what you're into, I guess. Luke also claims that he joined the Emperor in part to try and trick him and play double agent, so kudos for keeping Luke's cleverness, I guess. But he actually does fall for real, and it's played more as mind control than anything more meaningful. Also, the Emperor keeps coming back, but he's hot now, and he wants to possess Han and Leia's baby because his clone bodies keep burning out. And writer Tom Veitch clearly wanted the Solo baby in this comic to be their only kid, judging by Han wanting to name the baby Han Jr. and Leia overriding it with Anakin. But Dark Empire and Thrawn were being made around the same time, and Timothy Zahn was a faster writer, so Veitch had to set his comics after the Thrawn trilogy and include the Solo twins from those books as minimal cameos. Also, Luke falls head over heels in love with a girl named Jem, and their total interactions are just 7 pages, and then she dies. Dark Empire is bad, let's move on. In general, as time passed and people wrote stories about Luke restoring the Jedi Order and training more and more students, he became sort of a messianic figure in EU works, becoming Jedi Grand Master and letting the next generation of Jedi become the main characters, which honestly I do like as a concept. He's done with his character arc and he gets out of the way to let other people do theirs, like Kyle Katarn or Jaina Solo, though sometimes he takes more direct roles again. This does, however, mean getting away from him as a real character and he becomes more of a background figure. And thus, fans got used to Luke in this more symbol-based role as just a super cool Force guy who forces real good and is the best and purest Jedi of all. And don't get me wrong, it's super satisfying for this to be the path of Luke Skywalker as a character. At least until after he dies, and then the Sith return and destroy the Jedi Order all over again, and now it's up to Luke's drug-addicted great-grandson, who Luke visits as a ghost to yell at for doing drugs. Thanks for repeating the cycle all over again, Star Wars. Hope that doesn't happen again. My point should be clear. Over time, Luke faded from the protagonist role, except for a few stories, and became the paragon for younger heroes to aspire to. That is great. Love that for him. And in concept, I vastly prefer it to the way things would pan out in the Disney canon. But what also happened is that this idea of him as a paragon totally overshadowed perception of what his character was really like in the movies. Luke Skywalker is now the hero, TM, capital letters, and for some people, that made him boring. He basically ended up on the same level as Superman, as I said before. And this is, broadly, where he's at when we get to the Disney sequel trilogy. I want to focus on Episode 7 for a bit, which might seem odd because Luke doesn't even talk in this one, but it's still super important. Because of his silence, and because of the way he is spoken about throughout the movie, Luke is in it as the purest distillation of his legend.
Luke Skywalker, I thought he was a myth.
He's gone missing somehow, and the entire movie is predicated on the idea that he's the coolest paragon ever, and all the heroes need to do is find him, and he'll make everything okay. He's a ghost in the narrative, but his legend is basically the driving force of the entire film. Even Leia, who is also Force-sensitive and is leading the Resistance on top of that, is not seen as sufficient. And, of course, why wouldn't Luke be needed to lead the galaxy out of darkness again? He is the hero. TM. Capital letters. There's a key difference in how finding Luke is treated here compared to Luke himself looking for Obi-Wan in Hope or Yoda in Empire. He found his mentors very quickly, and they, in turn, quickly cemented their roles as teachers to facilitate his story. Luke did assume he would find Obi-Wan, and Obi would take it from there, but this is just the refusal of the call part of the hero's journey, and the true roles are adopted by the halfway point of the film. Obi-Wan literally kills himself to get out of the way of Luke's story, so yeah. And Yoda is sought out explicitly to train Luke to be the big hero. But in Force Awakens, finding Luke is basically treated as finding the real hero to come and be the big hero, not finding a teacher for Rey.
Well, because of you, now we have a chance. The General's been after this for a long time.
If Skywalker returns, the new Jedi will rise.
Whomever you're waiting for on Jakku, they're never coming back. There's someone who still could.
Resistance must be destroyed before they get to Skywalker.
Even while the film builds up Rey as her own hero, her finding Luke is presented as more to serve his story than hers. It ends with Rey holding out Luke's old lightsaber to him, not asking for his help training her, but asking him to take up his sword and return. Imagine if it took Luke a whole movie to find Obi-Wan on Tatooine, and when he does, we don't even get Kenobi training him until the sequel. When you build up Luke so much in this way, there are two natural routes for the rest of the story to take. Either Luke takes up the sword and becomes the big hero, thus relegating the protagonists of Episode 7 to mere delivery vessels, or throw in a twist of some kind. Take a page from The Wizard of Oz by showing the man behind the curtain as more human than the lofty legend he inspired. I mean, honestly, by building up Luke's mythic stature so much without letting the audience actually see him, it's perfectly teeing up a subversion of expectations. So now, let's talk about Battlefront II, the second one. EA's Battlefront 2, what an absolute clown show of corporate greed. So bad it got the Belgian government to investigate the game for gambling practices. Also, it has a campaign, and I'd like to talk about that briefly. This might seem like a swerve, but I think this is important because this game was released on November 17th, 2017, a month before Episode 8. In one level, you play as Luke. And this was the version of him that many Star Wars fans saw right before jumping into that movie. In this campaign, the main characters are Imperial defectors from Inferno Squad, and you play as Luke as he meets one of them right before the actual defection. This encounter with the Jedi basically inspires the Inferno guy he meets to abandon the Empire in the first place.
I'm not blind. I know what the Empire is capable of, but what else is there? A choice.
Here, Luke is wise, serene, understanding, and redeeming. All the things we would expect from a Jedi like him. He even apologizes for killing stormtroopers in self-defense, which he has never done before.
Is that what got you past my men, or was it the light setting? I'm sorry.
Here, he is the Paragon, casually planting seeds of redemption inside another Imperial main character while barely trying. There isn't much to talk about in terms of in-depth characterization because there isn't any. He's not the main character, so this is fine. It's like how he is in Jedi Outcast. But I just wanted to point out that this appearance reinforced the ideal image of the character just 1 month before The Last Jedi. So I'll just say this now. If you've been paying attention, you could probably tell that I was building up to me saying that I love this movie's portrayal of Luke. And, if you've been paying attention, you can probably guess why pretty accurately. While there's a lot of people who say that Last Jedi threw away what Force Awakens was setting up, I think Force Awakens was teeing up this sort of subversion pretty well. There's been some discourse around subversion of expectations in the wake of this film and especially the end of Game of Thrones. The idea is that these stories were more concerned with being surprising than telling a story that made sense, and they made choices that swerved away from where the story had been naturally leading for the sake of shock value, with no actual substance to the new direction. I think that's fair for something like certain parts of Game of Thrones or Westworld, but for Last Jedi, I see a stronger through line. As I described earlier, the way Luke was built up as a legend in Force Awakens without seeing him as a person is prime setup for a subversion. This happens all the time, like in Heart of Darkness or its film version Apocalypse Now, and I mentioned Wizard of Oz earlier. Not to directly compare the quality or prestige of these works to Last Jedi, I only want to say that subverting a legend is a natural storytelling choice, especially given the void of real characterization for Luke that Episode 7 gave us. And besides, if Rian Johnson's only concern was subversion of expectations and disrespecting Star Wars, he would have had Luke just get killed by the AT-ATs on Crate right here. Now, I want to laser focus on a particular moment. The moment everyone hates, where Luke tosses the lightsaber over his shoulder. But before that, I want to talk about a completely different moment in Rise of Skywalker. It's the very end of Episode 9, when Rey goes to the Lars homestead to bury Luke and Leia's lightsabers there. The common criticism is that this makes no sense as anything other than fan service. Rey has no personal connection to that place, though I think we have to assume that the legend of Luke in-universe includes his birthplace, so it's not out of line for her to at least know about the farm. Still, a stretch emotionally. Leia has no connection to that place either, and Luke would not think of his old home fondly given that he spent the last few years of his life there begging to leave. In-universe, it's hard to tell who this is supposed to be emotionally resonant for. It's just for the audience, so it feels hollow. And if Rey is only there to honor Luke and Leia, it makes her seem like she still does not understand them as people and only considers their legends. I bring this up because when I watched that scene and had those thoughts about it, I suddenly noticed a deeper layer to the lightsaber toss in Last Jedi. So let's return to that scene, and I want you to think about it from Luke's perspective. He's on an island where he's gone to live in seclusion because he feels he let the legend of himself go to his head, cause him to become arrogant and complacent, and doom the Jedi. This part is explicitly spelled out in his later scenes.
Because I was Luke Skywalker, Jedi Master.
He is here suffering from guilt and depression, in part because of the legend built around himself. Now, here comes some random woman he doesn't know, and she holds up a lightsaber. Not just any lightsaber, but Anakin's lightsaber, the Skywalker Legacy saber. And how would Luke feel about this lightsaber? When was the last time he saw it? As far as the films are concerned, he hasn't seen this since he lost it on Bespin, when he had his hand chopped off and Darth Vader completely crushed the legends he had built for himself about both Obi-Wan and Anakin.
It's not true!
It is past baggage he didn't even know he was carrying when he lost it, now representative of a total loss of innocence, and the last time in his life when legends were proven false, and the fallibility of his idols was laid bare before him.
I was once a Jedi Knight, the same as your father. He was the best star pilot in the galaxy, and a cunning warrior, and he was a good friend.
I wish I'd known him.
Your father's lightsaber. This is the weapon of a Jedi Knight. A young Jedi named Darth Vader, who was a pupil of mine until he turned to evil. He betrayed and murdered your father.
I want to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like my father.
Why wish you become Jedi?
Mostly because of my father, I guess.
How for Jedi was he?
Obi-Wan never told you what happened to your father.
He told me you killed him.
I am your father.
Why didn't you tell me?
He's been using a different lightsaber ever since, for 30 years. Rey has no understanding of this. She just thought, like many fans did at the time, that this was Luke's lightsaber and he would gladly take it up and honor it, without really thinking or knowing about what he as a person would really feel. But it's not necessarily something that he would have positive feelings towards. He would likely feel ambivalent in the best of times, and this is not the best of times. Now, he's been handed an artifact that he last saw during his own loss of innocence and his own disillusionment with those he looked up to, at a time when he is totally disillusioned with himself, the Jedi, and the very concept of idolization. And he's been handed this by a woman who clearly looks up to him with the same hero worship he once had for Anakin and Obi-Wan, and she wants him to be something he no longer wants to be. Of course he chucks it over his shoulder, and it's brilliant. It's provocative, evocative, completely in character, and serves the movie's goal of demonstrating Luke's current cynical outlook while shocking and disturbing both Rey and the audience. Now, how much of what I just said was intentional on Rian Johnson's part? Maybe very little of it, but it doesn't matter because it fits together with Luke's history so well, and it serves the goals of the story that Johnson did clearly intend for. This movie gave us such an interesting version of Luke, and probably the best performance of Mark Hamill's career. And more than that, it made me see the entire character in a new light. The complete picture of Luke that I have been discussing this whole time only came into focus after I watched this movie. Like many people, I felt something was off when I saw Luke's behavior here. It wasn't matching up with the image of him I had in my head. But unlike those who said, "This behavior doesn't feel like Luke, I reject this," I said, "This doesn't feel like Luke, but why?" Luke's characterization in this film is very different, but perfectly in line with his established traits. Certain traits are emphasized more than they used to be, while others are downplayed, but nothing has come out of nowhere. His snarkiness, for example, is something that has always been there to some capacity or another, but it's been dialed up more than a little bit here to reflect his bitterness over his present situation.
Ow!
His propensity for creative and indirect solutions to problems, as well as his self-sacrificial bravery, are present in his appearance on Crate. And most importantly, but also most tragically, his extreme care for his friends and family caused both his exile and his return from it. As we've gone over, every movie in the original trilogy has an example of Luke losing his rationality and acting recklessly when those he loves are threatened. In Empire, it's even the result of a vague future vision.
I can't keep the vision out of my head. They're my friends. I gotta help them.
He doesn't have a moment where he directly confronts this flaw, he just pulls himself back from murder the last time we saw him succumb to it. In Last Jedi, it is this long-standing tendency that causes him to alienate Ben Solo. And for the record, if you're talking about this incident to accuse Luke of being out of character, and you use the footage from Kylo's version that shows Luke actively trying to kill him, but you're talking about it as if it's the real version of events, I hope all your Minecraft world saves get corrupted the moment you build the structure you're most proud of. Anyway, what happens is Luke is worried about the darkness he's sensing in Ben Solo's heart and decides to go confront him.
I went to confront him.
I admit it's ambiguous what confront means and why he's going to have this talk in the middle of the night while Ben's sleeping instead of just asking him to stay late after lightsaber class, but whatever. So Luke gets a future vision of Kylo bringing the galaxy to ruin and freaks out and thinks,
He would bring destruction and pain and death and the end of everything I love because of what he will become. And for the briefest moment of pure instinct, I thought I could stop it.
But he immediately stops himself.
It passed like a fleeting shadow.
And goes, wait, hold on, what am I doing? But unfortunately, lightsabers are loud, and Ben is apparently a light sleeper. Or maybe he sensed the moment of hostile intent from Luke and that woke him up. I see this as a disappointing but understandable mistake from Luke, though also admirable in how brief his freakout here really was. It's perfectly in line with the kind of mistakes that Luke made in the past. But I know a lot of people don't see it that way. They point to this idea of Luke as an unshakable optimist who put everything on the line to redeem his father, but he's now being written as wanting to kill his nephew in his sleep over a bad dream. Some even paint Luke's impulse here as premeditated, which is flagrantly false. I hope from my discussions of the original trilogy that it's clear Luke has always been more complicated than that. And I think that a lot of the arguments critics make to say that Luke is out of character in this film, and especially in this moment, are based on overly simplified interpretations of the original character, reinforced by roles he took in the old EU and in stories like Battlefront II. But there is a perfectly understandable reason behind this reaction that is valid to have. You don't need to misrepresent the movie. It's okay to just not like this direction for the character. It does hurt to see Luke fail like this, especially after being used to stories where his Jedi revival did not fail, until the Legacy comics, which we already spoke about. To see Luke again on the big screen, after all this time, but to see him in this state is jarring and heartbreaking. It's supposed to be, this is an intended reaction by the filmmakers, but it's so easy to want to reject this story direction when there's a completely different, more affirming version of the character that was decanonized to give us this. And that would have been true if we'd gotten George Lucas's version of the sequels, which also had Luke hiding in failure after his Jedi were destroyed. But we generally like a happy ending, and Return of the Jedi was a happy ending. And it always hurts, always feels bad when a sequel comes out that feels like it invalidates such a thing. This is true of something like Men in Black 2, or Alien 3, or Paul Blart Mall Cop 2. And part of what causes this kind of hurt doesn't just come from our attachment to certain characters and wanting to see them do well, though that can certainly be a part of it. We generally like to feel that stories are consistent and make sense in what they're building to, and when a story makes an ending statement that is built up to, and it delivers a particular ending for a character with everything framed as that being the end point of their arc, it is too often a swerve to then say, oh, well actually this didn't last. It didn't end the way the previous movie said it did, now here's a sequel that backtracks on what we saw. General audiences of popular entertainment tend to want a sense of meaningful change in their media, and meaningful progression forwards to a happier state of being than what came before. And most stories, before a sequel comes out, are written to deliver that state. Star Wars is no different, with Return of the Jedi clearly ending on a note that the evil of the Emperor is defeated, and whatever danger may come, it will not be the same as before. The galaxy, as a whole, is moving forward. The old EU gave us forward progression and new conflicts with Thrawn and the Yuuzhan Vong, but also gave us regressive, recycled threats like the Reborn Emperor in Dark Empire, or Darth Krayt's Sith from Star Wars Legacy, or the boatload of Death Star knockoffs. In setting up the state of the galaxy for The Force Awakens, J.J. Abrams and Lawrence Kasdan wrote things in such a way that required failure from Luke, Han, Leia, and the rest of the New Republic.
He was training a new generation of Jedi. An apprentice turned against him, destroyed it all. Luke felt responsible, walked away from everything.
They wanted a sort of fusion of both paths for conflict, but leaned more heavily into the regressive side of things. All this is to say, I think a lot of the complaints of Luke being written out of character in Last Jedi come from a place of valid disagreement with the direction of the story. But it's generally unfair to not engage with fiction on its own terms, and to criticize it for not being the story you wanted to see going in. It's especially unfair when, in order to justify an ultimately emotional reaction, a lot of people will deliberately ignore parts of the movie and completely make up certain details to give themselves a veil of logical legitimacy. Given a 30-year jump forward in time, a traumatic event that Luke sees as entirely his fault, and his resulting disillusionment with the Jedi and himself, I think it is perfectly natural for Luke's existing character traits from the original trilogy to evolve into the form they take in this film. He is different, but I can see a through line back to the originals with every characterization choice made. It's fine if you disagree and think that Luke is written poorly, but make sure you are not basing that judgment off of imagined details about his characterization across all of his films. I suppose it would be fair to say that Rian Johnson messing with the existing personality sliders on a post-time skip Luke is technically an inconsistency, but I'd hardly call it out of character. Honestly, I would say that Luke being snarkier and depressed is less out of character than him being perfectly serene about the whole ordeal and not having a bitter bone in his body. Rian Johnson has said that when he was handed the plot point of Luke hiding out on Ahch-To, based off George Lucas's own treatments for what a new trilogy would be like, he could not imagine Luke just hiding away while the galaxy goes to hell unless he believed he was doing the right thing. That it would be more out of character for Luke to be capable of helping and willing to help, but not doing so. Luke needed to believe that his presence would make things worse to justify him not being around for those he loves. If he was just training up another secret Jedi Order, then why would he need Rey to show up to bring him back into the fight? I know Mark Hamill did not agree at first, which plenty of anti-fans use as ammo to attack the movie with. They always leave out that Hamill very publicly came to see the value in this version of Luke, or if they do acknowledge it, they claim that Disney forced him to say this at gunpoint. I suppose it's possible that Hamill was influenced by Disney to change his tune, though if that was the case, he would surely have retracted his retraction by now. But it doesn't really matter. With all due respect to Mark, which is a hell of a lot of respect for the professionalism and talent it took to give this performance for a film he had such disagreements with, but with all due respect to Mark, I think he walked into The Last Jedi just as blinded to the realities of Luke Skywalker as most of the fans. Keep in mind, he was Luke on and off for 6 or so years, and then spent the next 30 years being the guy who played Luke Skywalker, returning to the role in parodies, but being more inundated with the sentiment of what Luke meant to fans than immersed in the actual psychology of the character. As sacrilegious as this may sound to some, I think Johnson approached writing Luke in this movie with clearer eyes than Hamill initially approached acting in it. And Hamill was absolutely correct in knowing how upset fans would be at seeing Luke like this, but that doesn't mean that concerns over the accuracy and consistency of the character are truly airtight. Apparently, Hamill also thought Luke cutting off the arm of a Wampa way back in Empire was animal cruelty that Luke Womp-Rat Bullseye or Skywalker would never do, so take that as you will. Ultimately, though Last Jedi Luke was off-putting to me at first, he was intriguing, partly because he did not match up with who I expected him to be, and I was willing to roll with things and see where the movie went. Then I revisited the originals with the mythic veil torn down and saw a version of the character I had always overlooked but now love more than ever. And another part of my ability to enjoy this characterization comes from how I felt and feel about the setup for the sequel trilogy. I don't like it. I don't like the First Order coming back as a resurgent empire fighting the Resistance in a way that so closely resembles the shape of the original trilogy's conflict. I don't like Snoke at all as a wannabe Emperor knockoff, and I think it would have been much more interesting if he never existed and Kylo, Hux, and Phasma were of equal status in a power struggle, while the First Order fought a more evenly matched New Republic. But I can set that aside and say to myself, okay, this is the premise, I have to swallow that pill, where do they go from here? And as I watched Last Jedi, I saw Luke's disillusionment with the cyclical fall of the Jedi mirror my own dislike of the sequel trilogy's cyclical premise. I oddly identified with him a lot, and as he regained hope in the future of the Jedi and the future of the galaxy, as he performed the most impressive feat of Force use we've ever seen in live action and reignited hope in the galaxy, I found hope for the franchise reignited within myself. I like Luke's characterization here in part for reasons just as emotional and irrational as those anti-fans have for hating it. I hope I've justified why I feel it was consistent and compelling, but my own human irrationality worked in such a way that I was willing to give it a chance to win me over in the first place. For others, their irrationality led them to reject it immediately. I'd like to wrap up this section by talking about how Luke dies. There are two ways you could describe this scene, one literal and one symbolic and thematic. In the literal description, Luke has failed to revive the Jedi, spent years in isolation, and then uses the Force too hard and dies just to distract the bad guys without really damaging them. The thematic reading is this. After spending years plagued by his failure to live up to the impossible standard of his own legend, Luke comes to terms with his failures and fallibility, and reignites his legend so powerfully that the flawed human he really was literally transcends his mortal limitations, leaving only the idealized legend behind and inspiring hope across the entire galaxy. One reading is extremely negative, and the other is extremely positive, and both are accurate ways to describe the end of Luke's arc in this movie. But for a long time, Star Wars has promoted the literal at the expense of the thematic. From over-explaining every individual in the Mos Eisley Cantina to deciding that the Death Star's flaw needed to be explained as sabotage, rather than letting it be a weakness of hubris in an arrogant fascist dictatorship. So some people hyperfixate on the literal reading of Luke's death to claim that a movie that reaffirms him is really built to tear him down and disrespect him. Even if I personally prefer to think of Luke's Jedi Academy as successful, I will always love The Last Jedi and Luke's arc within it. And I can credit this film for making me really appreciate the depth of character that he always had. Just like Rey, and just like Luke before Ben's turn to the dark, I was blinded by the legend that surrounded him, the pop cultural fixation. In some ways, watching Luke's arc play out changed the very way I watch movies, as I tried to work out why, despite the initial misgivings I had, I still walked out of the theater the first time feeling good about the movie and about the future of Star Wars. I came to realize how much I valued themes and character arcs, and realized the value of judging a work of art based on the story it is actually interested in telling, rather than the story I would have preferred it to tell. The Last Jedi is far from a perfect movie, but of the flaws it has, its handling of Luke Skywalker is not one of them. Now, Rise of Skywalker, on the other hand, actually, it's fine. I mean, as far as Luke's characterization is concerned. I do not like the movie, but Luke's portrayal here is pretty okay. I think it's funny that for a movie that clearly is trying to backpedal on the most controversial aspects of the last movie, the way it does so for Luke ends up being perfectly in line with how his arc resolved. When Luke catches the legacy saber and makes a wry remark about how
a Jedi's weapon deserves more respect,
I can just so clearly see Abrams and Terrio high-fiving over sticking it to that one scene from the last movie everyone hated. But this still works, as Luke wryly acknowledging how he's come around to respecting the Jedi again and humbly poking fun at himself. When he says he was wrong to hide on Ahch-To, that lines up perfectly with the perspective I think he would have had even if Rian Johnson was still writing him.
And I will not be the Last Jedi.
It feels to me like being continuous with Last Jedi by accident, but it is still continuous. I don't think there's anything more to say about Rise of Skywalker in this context. I guess it's weird that Luke seems cool with his lightsaber being buried at the Lars homestead. Him lifting the X-Wing doesn't bring him any new closure he didn't already have, but it doesn't undermine anything either. I don't know, there's really nothing substantive to say about his character. Speaking of nothing substantive about Luke Skywalker, let's talk about it's okay. Cool, but empty. Luke's not a real character here, he's a big capstone of fan service to show fans the perfect Luke Skywalker people wanted to see in the sequel trilogy, where he shows up to save the day, kills robots real good, is emotionless and perfect, and completely steals the show from the real main characters. But Din Djarin the Mandalorian does actually defeat the bad guy himself, so it's more of an encore than anything else. It's fine. I just wouldn't want such a flat version of the character to serve more than a cameo role in anything. And this certainly would not have been the right track for Last Jedi. But it's fine and fun to see Luke in his prime, and not even contradictory with how he will eventually become, since, in terms of character, his very own hallway scene doesn't give anything more than he's real good at fighting, and he presents himself as pretty serene and calm to strangers, both of which we already saw in Return of the Jedi. I suppose you could read this as him playing up his legend to the galaxy at large, and I guess the way he dispatches with the Dark Troopers shows he still has the capacity for brutality when his opponents are mindless robots, but I can already feel his Mando characterization tearing what with all the stretching I'm doing to it. Imagine what that must mean after you've sat through all the rest of this video. The real trepidation I have with his portrayal here is that so many people who disliked him in Last Jedi think that this is the way Luke should have been. A flat cardboard cutout that reinforces the idea of him instead of playing off the real character. He works in this capacity when he's not a main character, but my worry is that future works of Star Wars will overcorrect the perceived mistake of Episode 8 for the sake of pleasing the unpleasable who have dominated Star Wars discourse since the 90s, if not earlier. But we'll just have to see. I have a surprising amount to say about Boba Book in general for a show as painfully average as this, but maybe another day. The 6th episode of the 7-episode show about Boba Fett focuses heavily on Luke Skywalker attempting to train Grogu, and what we see of this training was oddly evocative to me. When Luke is showing off to Grogu by coyly lifting frogs, I'm glad I got to say that sentence, I saw this as him being playful in that familiar Luke Skywalker way, closer to Episode 6 but soon to become his snark in Episode 8. We then see him running Grogu through certain exercises and also running with Grogu on his back. And I have no idea what Grogu is supposed to gain from sitting in a backpack on someone else's morning cardio, but Luke appears to be trying to replicate Yoda's lessons for him as much as possible. And that's where I find some depth to pick at here. Luke is faced with an infant version of one of his two teachers, the teacher who gave him the most direct training, as his first student. He's never done this before, but he knows restoring the Jedi is his next mission in life, so he defaults to imitation of what came before. I think one could argue that this is inconsistent with the Luke who defeated the Emperor by disproving his master's beliefs that Vader could not be redeemed, but it's an inconsistency that is very human given the different situation and the different kind of pressure put on him now, not to mention where we know his character is headed. In this way, the fan service-laden recreations of Luke's old training actually serve to underline his emotions and motivations for this sequence. And they appropriately foreshadow the way he fails to effectively teach Grogu to focus on Jedi training by imposing the Old Order's no attachments rule. This carries echoes of Luke's arc in the Thrawn trilogy books in a way where he is at a loss for how to rebuild the Jedi without a guide. The guides he did have venerated the old ways, and he has not yet come to see the Old Order as a failure. So, in this show, he tries to do what he thinks they would do. He defaults to imitating the past instead of innovating, dooming his nascent Jedi Order to destruction. A wise cautionary tale for us all. His talk with Ahsoka is also rather intriguing. In the presence of someone who is older than him, more experienced, who knows the old Jedi Order and was directly apprenticed to his father, Luke is more vulnerable. He seems a little insecure about being able to properly train Grogu and asks Ahsoka for advice.
It's more like he's remembering than I'm actually teaching him anything. Sometimes I wonder if his heart is in it. What should I do about him?
Trust your instincts.
This hints that he really doesn't want to have to do this whole restoring the Jedi thing alone. And while he is not necessarily asking Ahsoka to do anything for him, he does want help and advice from someone he knows is more experienced in the ways of the Jedi than he is, which makes perfect sense for someone in his position. I really want to see more of Luke and Ahsoka. The potential for their dynamic, now that we know they have in fact met, is so rich. I don't want a live-action scene, though. The tech they're using to de-age Luke's face and voice isn't really capable of the emotionality I would want.
Grogu, let me help you remember. Very good. Have you heard anyone talk like that back home?
To say nothing of the shady morality of using it. But a comic miniseries would be perfect. And this miniseries might even have enough real depth so that I don't have to stretch as hard as I'm doing right now. It seems that Luke in Book of Boba Fett is being written to walk a careful line between what both fans and anti-fans of Last Jedi would appreciate. This is a fairly admirable achievement, even if the method they use to portray him leaves a lot to be desired. Since the Favreau and Filoni shows are all clearly building to bridge the gap to the sequel trilogy, despite what the conspiratorial types may think about a retcon happening.
Impressive.
I think this tightrope is a line that future works are going to try to walk as well. I only hope that the depth of Luke's character is maintained and restored while doing so. So, after all of that, what is there left to say? I love Luke Skywalker. I didn't used to. There was a lot about him that I didn't notice, and I was an edgy boy who loved villains. But now, he's one of my all-time favorites. And it took what many people perceive to be a total disrespect of his character for me to truly begin to respect him. I don't expect everyone to agree with me, but I wanted to describe my own personal journey with the character and the conclusions I've come to about him. I hope that if you've never considered any of this stuff about Luke, I've given you something to think about. Even if you don't agree with my interpretations, I hope that the mere consideration of them enhances the way you do understand him. There are so many ways to engage with art, and so many different ways art can affect us. So many different ways that we can relate to the characters we follow. But the nature of attachment to art can sometimes get us emotional, lock us into rigid thinking. Now, I'm not trying to endorse total non-attachment in the vein of the old Jedi Order. Attachments are great and cool, but you always have to take a step back every once in a while. Pay mind to fresh perspectives, and not get so defensive about what you are attached to that any challenge to your existing opinions gets you frothing at the mouth like a rabid chihuahua. People can get so defensive about their favorite characters, so afraid of any perceived disrespect to them, to the point that it makes them fragile. But if you open yourself up to different interpretations, if you're willing to let go a bit, accept that these characters are not under your control, and just see where things go, who knows? You might just be pleasantly surprised. And if not, they're just stories. Someone else's interpretation of your favorite characters. You don't have to like them, you just have to give them an honest chance. That's what I did, and it's how I came to love Luke Skywalker. Also, the weird green milk sea cows were the purest distillation of what it means to be Star Wars, and they're wonderful. No, I will not elaborate. Goodbye.